welcome to the session on the status of the California Waterfix. I'm sure you're all anxious to hear how we're going to fix California water. But we're moving really from some of the discussion we had in the water sector earlier today, which was more general policy issues around how we manage and renew all of our water infrastructure, kind of the one water idea. And this afternoon we're moving to a much more specific piece of infrastructure that is located in the California Delta. And we've got a map up here just to orient us. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what happens in the Delta is critical to Southern California. Something like 30% of the water supply on average is provided by exports from or conveyance through the Delta and into the State Water Project for delivery to Southern California. But it's actually more important than the 30% would indicate because it's Southern California's best supply of the freshest, highest quality water. So a lot of the other water uses in Southern California in terms of recycling and reuse depend upon periodic infusions of new, fresh, clean water. And that's one reason why what happens in the Delta is critical to what happens in Southern California, where the water supply is insufficient to maintain the population, the lifestyles, and the economy that we depend upon. And unfortunately, the Delta is in failure mode. And I say that with all recognition of how serious it is to talk about failure mode. But it is failing as an estuary, as an ecosystem. It's failing as a reliable water supply. And its deterioration and uncertainty has starved it for capital investment of all kinds, whether we're talking about levees or we're talking about roads, bridges, power supply, gas lines, etc. And so the one thing that we can say is that the status quo in the Delta is not sustainable. These failures are sewn in to the current fabric in the Delta. And the question really for us is, in light of the fact that the Delta is in failure mode and it's not sustainable, the question is, will we figure out a strategy for managing it, or will we be responding to the crisis when it comes at its own time and place? So for this panel, we've really got a number of people who are deeply knowledgeable about what's going on in the Delta, what the options are, what kinds of management strategies are available to us. So the four perspectives, I'll start with Jeff Keitlinger, the general manager of the Metropolitan Water Districts of Southern California. And I would say generally, I'm expecting Jeff will bring to this panel a utility perspective, but I really want to place him more as the steward who is responsible for the 22 million Californians who are Delta dependent. Then, because the infrastructure we're talking about is going to have a big price tag, regardless of what it ends up exactly being, we thought it would be important to have a perspective on how it gets financed and what the challenges and opportunities are around the water fix, whatever that turns out to be. And then because the Delta is not just and that's Chris Higgins, the managing director at Goldman Sachs, who will be talking to us about the project financing opportunities and challenges. And then finally, Mark Pruner, who lives in the Delta. He's a lawyer, and he is the chairman of the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Delta Protection Commission, which is the commission authorized by the state of California to make sure that this precious Delta is protected as it goes through the changes that are required because it's currently in failure mode. And then finally, Jay Ziegler, who should be on the panel, at the last minute was called away. He is managing director for the Nature Conservancy and would have brought to this panel some specific environmental riverine ecology perspective. And so maybe from time to time I'm going to try and channel Mr. Ziegler. But we're here at a pivotal moment because there are several long developing processes that are coming now to a conclusion. So my position as Delta Water Master reports jointly to the State Water Resources Control Board and to the Delta Stewardship Council. Both of those agencies are part of this long simmering public processes that are coming to conclusion now. The State Board is managing an update after 20 years to the Delta Water Quality Control Plan, which will have significant impacts on water quality and therefore the ecology and the water resource reliability in the Delta. The Delta Stewardship Council, on the other hand, is in the process of updating the 2013 Delta Plan and looking at elements of that plan that include levee maintenance, include investment in conveyance and other kinds of infrastructure, storage above the Delta and throughput below the Delta, and then finally the ecosystem chapter, which is currently being updated. So we've got those two agencies that are deeply involved in Delta planning, and then we've got the proposal by the state and federal projects to Waterfix. And so all of that is coming together right now, and it's orchestrated to the extent it's orchestrated through the California Water Action Plan. And so the format of this panel is going to be not a series of presentations, but an ongoing dialogue about the major issues. And I'm going to start with a couple of questions, a question for each of the panelists, but I have encouraged them to use that as a kickoff and to get into dialogue and discussion. And unlike some other panels, we don't mind if you interrupt, and if there are questions that come up as we're talking about it, there is no question that we could ask that these gentlemen would not be capable of fielding in real time. So I'm going to start, Jeff, with you and just ask you, this project, this proposed project, has undergone a lot of forced metamorphosis over the last few months. Can you give our audience kind of an update on where the project stands, what it looks like today?
Sure, thank you, Michael. So real briefly, I thought it'd be useful to just get a feel for what this means and why Metropolitan does support this project for Southern California. Metropolitan supplies water to 6 counties across Southern California, 19 million people. That's 1 in every 2 Californians live in Southern California, and we are the wholesale provider to those 19 million people from Ventura County all the way down to San Diego County. And those 2 main sources of water that we provide to Southern California, about 55% of all of Southern California's water comes from 2 places. It comes from the Colorado River, which Metropolitan owns and operates, the Colorado River Aqueduct, and that's about 25% of all of Southern California's water. And then from Northern California through the State Water Project, and that's about 30% of Southern California's water. Together, those are about 55% of all the water we consume here in Southern California come from those 2 places. What's an important factor, I mean, besides the sheer volume of that, it's really hard to just sort of say we're going to replace 30% or 25% of something. But besides the sheer volume, Michael touched on it, the water quality is very important. The water we get from the Colorado River is about 700 parts per million salt in it. Our groundwater basins that we replenish and recharge, and I know this because the regional board reminds me very often about this, and I see them in the audience, says they don't like to put water more salty than 500 parts per million in those basins. Our Northern California State Water Project supplies that come off the Sierras tend to be about 200 parts per million. And so we can blend that Colorado River water and use it to put in and serve a much healthier, less salty supply, keep our basins fresh. And that's critically important to all our plans to recycle more, to use our basins more, replenish. All that salt issue builds up. So that's critically important to Southern California. So the project is, as as Michael was talking about, this failing delta, right now we capture the water in the Sierras north of the delta, in the eastern and in the western Sierras there, northern western Sierras, primarily in two places, the Shasta Reservoir and Oroville Reservoir. We capture that water, we release it to the Sacramento River, and then we turn on pumps at the south end of the delta and push that water down the California aqueduct that you see down Highway 5. Ever since the 1930s, California has known that moving water is problematic through the delta. It's this labyrinth of channels, and it's a maze of old dikes and levee system that we're pulling the water through this system that we've known forever that we need to do something, a plumbing fix here. So in the 1930s, they proposed a bypass system of a canal. In the 1960s, when they did the state project, they authorized again building a bypass to that. In the 1980s, we went with a peripheral canal to the California voters, voted it down, and walked away for the third time. Duke Magian proposed building something called Duke's Ditch that would be an armored system in the delta. Again, controversial, walked away from it. Every year, the amount of water we can move through the delta every year gets cut back for all sorts of environmental issues. We are always at risk of earthquake. We pick up a lot of bromides and organic matter, and we degrade the water as it moves through the delta farming system. We've always known the smart thing to do is to build a bypass. Jerry Brown, young Jerry Brown, was governor on the peripheral canal vote. Wiser Jerry Brown, or older Jerry Brown, is now the governor as we look at California Waterfix. The Waterfix approach was going to be, we looked at canals, channels, we looked at all the old plans, but with modern technology, the idea is build a tunnel system, pick up the water north of the delta, and bypass the delta by going underneath it. A lot less obtrusive, more expensive, but a lot less obtrusive on the natural environment and in the terrain and for the people of the delta. But it's expensive. It was going to be a 9,000 cubic feet per second, two 40-foot barrel tunnels, roughly 40 miles long, 35 to 40 miles long, and it was going to cost $17 billion. Well, some of the agricultural districts on the Central Valley Project federal contractor side opted out and said that's just too expensive because all the cost of this is going to be 100% borne by the water contractors, not by the state or the federal government. So when they opted out, we began looking at what does that mean? Does the urban areas pick up their share of it and have more supply for that? Or do we phase the project? And the idea we're looking at, frankly, right now, it hasn't been announced, but probably will be this week or so, is frankly, we're looking at maybe we phase this project. At some point, Congress is going to have to step in and figure out the federal contractors' share and do something with it. But if you wait around for Congress these days, you don't want to be holding your breath. So we decided that the logical thing is to move forward with those that are willing, mostly on the state water project side, the metropolitans, the Santa Claras, the Silicon Valleys, a lot of the more the urban sector, Bakersfield areas. We'll move forward building one tunnel at this point and then move towards a second tunnel at some point when we get a little more support and help out of Congress to go finish the rest of the project. So that is the current concept. We're in discussions with everybody about how to finance, how to pay for that, how to restructure it, what changes have to be made in front of the state board on the permitting. So all that we hope will roll out over the next 6 to 8 weeks, and then we can get this thing stood up and start moving on that. And that's kind of the current game plan.
So thanks, Jeff. That's helpful. So from a roughly 17 billion double barrel full state and federal project solution, because the CVP has kind of pulled out, it's now essentially primarily the municipal and industrial contractors for the state water project. That has some big implications for how it's financed, how it's paid for. So Chris, to you, can you describe the financial challenges and some of the solutions for a project that's not 17 billion, but it's more than half of that. So it's a big number with a different group of ratepayers.
Certainly. Thanks, Michael, and thanks to Verde Exchange for letting us participate here. Happy to be here talking about this important project. Take a quick sort of pause on the question, and then I'll get to the question. Jeff talked about the service area that he provides water for in terms of population, counties, how many, surface area. We've had the good fortune of working with Metropolitan on their municipal bond sales in the past, and when we talk about Metropolitan, we talked about those things. We also talk about sort of what is in the service territory, and so depending on the year, the service territory, that 19 million people, might be also looked at as the 7th to 10th largest GDP in the world. And that's a pretty significant component of economic growth, both here in California and for the country. And so, as everyone sort of on a basic standpoint knows, GDP is driven by business, by productivity, and the underpinnings of that are, the ability to do those economic activities, and water is an important component of that. And so it's very important that we always point that out. And so what do investors care about when they look at that service territory, and they look at, whether they want to buy bonds or invest in a project in that area? They look at how reliable is that underpinning of this GDP, of this economic growth. And I think that's kind of the primary thing about this project from a investor perspective, is the reliability factor that it provides to this important part of the economy. There are lots of other elements to it, and we've done work over the last 10 years, even back to when Kathleen was working with us at Goldman. I remember her dragging me around the Central Valley meeting with people, but we've done analysis for a number of entities, not just Metropolitan, looking at sort of this project and what it means for them. In terms of the project itself, it's a big number. Even the larger number, the $17 billion project, it's a large infrastructure project, no doubt about it. That you can't cut it any other way. However, if you look at it compared to other large infrastructure projects over time, it's actually kind of right in the middle. If you look at the original state water project and you break it down on a cost per capita, that project was something like $1,500 per capita. The larger state water project that we're talking about doing in phases now, it was more like $700 per capita. So that just kind of puts in perspective, yeah, it's a big number, but from a large infrastructure project perspective, it's actually kind of right in the middle. And so people kind of have to wrap their heads around that, because these are big numbers, obviously. In terms of the going from the larger project to the smaller project, or the phase one of the project that would include a smaller subset of contractors, from a credit perspective, looking at the market, the good news is those entities that are left in phase one looking to perhaps move forward with financing this thing are all of high credit quality. And so what does that mean? That means that they're rated, Metropolitan in particular is rated in the mid-AA category, and that is nearly as good as it gets, right? And so Metropolitan being 26% of the original project, and probably a larger component of a phase one, really gives a lot of support to the credit analysis. And the other entities involved are all highly rated. The way it would work, really, that we're kind of envisioning it, is you look at the entities involved, and you'd create some sort of financing joint powers agency. And so that group basically would come together and say, we're in for X amount, we're in for Y amount, so they subscribe for the whole amount. And then the credit sold to the market is a sort of amalgamation of those credits, and there's specific analysis you do to sort of derive what the underlying rating would be on the bonds, et cetera. We think it's financeable. It's certainly, like I said before, it's a project that's it's a big number, but it's as far as infrastructure projects go, it's kind of right in the middle. And in terms of the market, the municipal bond market is very, it's in a good spot right now to take on something like this, and we expect investors, particularly looking at utility investment in California. It's a strong market right now, so we're very bullish on that.
So the project has been downsized to meet the needs of the people who will finance it, and it sounds like Chris is itching to sell those municipal bonds. So we've talked about this project from the perspective of Southern California, why it's so important, and because of that importance, how it can be financed. I'd like to turn to you, Mark, who lives in Cortland, and we'll look at this project across the river. How does it look to you?
First of all, thank you, Michael and Verity Exchange, for having this panel. I think it's extremely timely because I think water is one of those things that's personal to everybody. Everybody cares that you don't have to go out to the house in the back or the pump and kind of pump your water, or maybe even in the kitchen. Everybody cares so much so I think that they take for granted that you turn on the spigot and the water flows and you don't have to think about it. And every single time, virtually I think, thanks to efforts that Jeff has undertaken, the water's clean, it's safe, and you don't have to worry about it. So I think that's an incredible, it's so fundamental. As my water law professor said, water is more valuable than gold, but people don't think about it because it seems like it's an endless supply. But of course, it's not. Let me just, Michael, if I can just maybe set a little bit of framework and just say a few things about the Delta that may not be common knowledge. There's a map of it. San Francisco's off to the left. Sacramento is up to the right-hand corner, up there, and then San Francisco to the left, about the middle, approximately. And I live toward the top area. My house is 3 houses from the river, approximately. It's hard to measure these things when you're out in the country. So I've got a personal stake as a volunteer, having been engaged in the water discussions for approximately 12 years now. One of the regulatory agencies that Michael referred to is the Delta Protection Commission. In 2009, it was set up or reconstituted by the legislature to represent the interests of the Delta. They're called Delta interests. And it does a pretty good job of that. My advisory committee is made up of 15 folks. One of those, my constituents, is, in a way, is Jeff here, because we have a water contractor slot that's, I think, being ably handled by Jason. Does a good job at advocating for water contractors' interests. My goal in that committee, where you have people suing each other, their entities, on the committee on a regular basis all the time, is to say to them, look, we're not here to fight fights you're fighting outside of this room. That's not what we're here for. We're here to come together and find ways that everybody can agree and make progress on the interests of the Delta, because the Delta interests, in large part, are the state interests. That's a really important thing not to forget, I think. The Delta is several 100,000 acres in size. It's got, if you include the portions of the cities around it, it's got about 800,000 people. It puts out about the same amount in terms of agricultural output. Roughly 500,000 acres in the Delta is currently engaged in agricultural production. So it's not a small thing of itself. Of course, in California, many things are small, which otherwise we know would not be. But it's a very important spot, in large part because you've got a rough 80-20 rule on water in operation, meaning that you've got approximately 20% of the people, roughly, living north of the Delta, and 80% of the water north of the Delta. Conversely, you've got approximately 80% of the population below the Delta and 20% of the water below the Delta. This is produced in the state without regard to the Colorado River. So that's a massive imbalance. In my neighborhood, folks are wanting to have the state of Jefferson. You've probably heard of that. That was a real idea until December 7, 1941. That was actually on its way to happening. That would be great for people in the North now, because they feel left out. They feel underrepresented. They feel nobody really cares because the votes, the money's in Southern California. We're going to get rolled no matter what. Some of them feel that way. I don't think the state of Jefferson will ever come to pass, because that would mean you have a whole state in the North with the water. Remember that 80-20? Selling water to folks in the South. And I don't think the people in the South will personally, I wouldn't vote for it if I lived down here. And I do remember living down here for a few decades. In the Delta, we see what Jeff talked about, what will be announced, the one tunnel, the size down project, and the phasing as a significant public policy moment in California. In the past, you may have heard Mark Twain's, it's really not Mark Twain's quote, it's attributed to him that whiskey is for drinking and water's for fighting. And whether or not that actually is something he said, the point remains that the water wars, the water fights for decades have been serious impediments to California moving forward in a better way. So I think, and what I am prepared to advocate for with my neighbors, not all that easy in some cases, is that we stand at this public policy crossroads to make and to implement great public policy. Let me just quickly illustrate what I mean by that. In the past, and even to some extent today, the project is presented and discussed, and the binders come out, focusing on the engineering, focusing on water equations, and they conclude that, you know what, folks in the South are getting thirsty. Folks in the North have a lot of water. The project equalizes that. And I could see that if that were it. And so the project, when it comes and rolls through my neighborhood, it's talked about in terms of we'll minimize your pain, right? We'll do pounding, we'll do lights, we'll do traffic, all these other things that are very consequential. Like my well's maybe going to dry up. That's pretty consequential to me where I live. But I think that misses the opportunity to even talk about equalizing the pain, which is another form of discussion. But I really think that the project has an opportunity. It's presented as an opportunity to the state to think about win-win opportunities across the board. And there's some specific solutions that are out there that I think accomplish that. And the State Water Board has to be a part of that. The resource agency, the federal government, and all of its arms, and the state regulatory agencies, I think it's possible to come together. So I'm hopeful, and I think great progress can be made if we make some effort. And I think that'll happen.
Okay, so this morning we talked a lot about one of the obstacles to managing water in California has to do with governance. So I'd like to throw out here for the panel some discussion about governance of this major project. In the old days, the State Department of Water Resources would organize, finance, build, operate, maintain the state water project on behalf of its customers and charge those customers. It seems like that governance structure is, would it be going too far to say, in tatters? So maybe we could talk a little bit about what the alternative governance structure is and what difference that will make.
Well, if the alternative governance structure is we're looking at forming two sort of what we call joint powers authorities to allow that to be managed outside of the state Department of Water Resources. And one is going to be for the specific design and construction of the project. This would be a JPA formed of contractors, including Metropolitan, and we would be responsible for the design and construction of the project. And once it's complete, turn it over, would sunset, disappear, and turn over the project to be operated by the California Department of Water Resources. And then the second issue is how to finance it. In the past, the state of California would issue bonds and then put it on our bills as state water contractors. But instead, what we'll be doing is forming a financing JPA that will issue the bonds on behalf of those contractors that are participating to build it and raising the money that way. There's two real large advantages of that. One is the capacity of state government to do large-scale infrastructure. People don't have the confidence that they once had that they have that capacity to do that in the fashion that they once did. If you look at examples like the Bay Bridge or perhaps what's going on in Oroville right now, just times have changed from the 1960s when the states used to take that on. Most states aren't out of the business of running utilities. They don't really are utility operators right now. Most states in the West have turned over their projects that they used to operate, as well as the Federal Bureau of Reclamation, turned that over to the actual contractors, established utilities whose mission it is to go do that. So in that sense, we think this is more going to a true utility model. It's a little different for the state. It took them some work to wrap their head around it, but they've accepted that this would be a smarter, more efficient way to do business rather than the state go out and try to hire 200 new people, engineers, to design this in-house themselves. It's better to basically outsource it to those agencies that know how to do that. So that's the current model. We think it's the best use of government resources, best return for the ratepayers. But it is definitely got some, it's different than how we've traditionally done things in California.
So that gets at the governance and financing of the project. Let's talk about the implications for management and operations of that project afterwards. That's always been a concern in the Delta, and here, if I'm supposed to be channeling the Nature Conservancy, the concern that a large infrastructure project could disadvantage the ecosystem and the Delta as an estuary to the disadvantage of the whole state for the purpose of slaking Southern California's thirst. And so there's always been this issue: if you build it, what are the conditions under which it'll be operated? And I would say that the same way the state's ability to finance and manage large projects has been called into question, there's also the question of how you manage and constrain the operation of the facility once it's completed. And that's an issue, here I am channeling again, for the fish migration through the Delta, for the health of the Delta as an estuary. But Mark, can you talk about the issues, the Delta-centric issues about how this project will be governed, managed, operated, if and when it comes into existence?
My understanding of Cal Waterfix's current governance, that's what you're asking? Perception on the ground, I will say, I'm not speaking as to what it is, but the perception on the ground is it will be managed as most other water projects are managed, kind of off in Sacramento or off in Washington, with not a lot of direct input from folks who've lived for generations on the land, or folks that have lived for generations being focused, highly focused on conservation measures within their own properties, because that's normally what they care about, and are already implementing water conservation measures as well as wildlife-friendly agricultural practices. I think that if this takes off maybe a little bit of an aside, if I can do that, there's my perception is that both at a congressional level and at a regulatory level, there's a major corner that's being turned, illustrated perhaps best by what soon will be the older biological opinions. Those are regulatory statements issued by NIMFS and Fish and Wildlife Service, two major federal regulatory bodies, that have required the water contractors, in many cases, to operate the pumps, the Delta, and water flows in general by the calendar. So if it's, I'm just arbitrarily saying it's March 1st, and some fish species was determined to be in need of extra water on March 1st. Irregardless of what actually was happening on the ground, irregardless of the rain cycle that year, irregardless of anything else, the pumps were on or off or adjusted because a calendar date was hit. Well, that doesn't really make sense. So in December of 2016, Congress signed into law by the President the WIN Act, which across the board said in a variety of columns, said we need to use real science / real-time science and adjust our water flows for what's actually happening on the ground. So for example, down by Walnut Grove, toward the top of the map, One of the major pieces of infrastructure that was built is called the Delta Cross Channel, which moves a huge amount of water from the main channel of the Sacramento River over to the east, so that that water can flow down what would be the eastern side of the delta to the pumps. I'm speaking very generally. But the fish agencies said, wait a minute, we have to protect the salmon. So we had to turn that off at kind of odd, what now we think is odd times. Well, it turned out the science said, wait a minute, the salmon aren't that active at night. And so if we close the Delta Cross Channel at night, we're really not doing that much to protect the salmon. So why can't we just open up the cross channel during the nighttime when the salmon generally aren't affected and run more water on the delta? So that's just one example. There's also the Delta Conservation Framework, which is being ground through at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's establishing a plan that goes out to 2050 in broad terms for conservation measures in the entire delta, set up on a regional approach. I think they have 6 regions, I believe. And the idea is to incorporate ground knowledge, regulatory knowledge, science with water needs and kind of blend them together, again, with more of a real-time effort. So that doesn't answer your question of governance exactly, but I think what it does is says that there is a mood change, I believe, I'm positive about it, that brings the governance will be handled in the future, bringing to the table 2 things: real-time science, as it's really happening now, also called adaptive management in some cases, and the interests and the needs and the focus of the residents and the industry and the agriculture that's in the Delta.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I've got about 2 hours of questions here, but I'm gonna give an opportunity for the audience at this point in the back.
Chris, just a quick question since you know all about the money. People, we said $700 per person in California.
In the service area.
But people are kind of shocked by the Delta price tag, but yet we'll spend $2 billion in a stadium without thinking about it. What are freeways and things like that cost the state? Because I don't think people think about what it costs to live in California for all the things.
Well, I mean,
What's the comparison? I don't think money is outrageous.
in terms of this project. Yeah, I mean, I think that was the point I was trying to make before, that if you, it is a big number, even the 11 billion phase 1 is a big number, but if you compare it to other large infrastructure projects, both in California and around the country, and you broke it down to sort of, highways or transportation's a little tougher, particularly freeways, breaking down per capita, because it's, measuring who it's serving is a little tougher because there's a lot of throughput, but the $700 per capita in the service territory of metropolitan of the counties that metropolitan serves, from a cost per capita perspective against large transportation infrastructure projects like the SR 91 in Riverside County. That was a $1 billion project. And that's putting cement on the ground. So, on a per capita basis, that's close to the 700. So, I mean, your point's well taken. I think I would say one other thing. Just wanted to take a second because you mentioned I'm eager to sell the bonds. I wanted to.
Was I wrong?
Well, I just wanted to qualify that I actually am a resident of Los Angeles, so I'm a ratepayer. And just matter of fact, it would be a good time to sell bonds because rates are low. And the market, as I was trying to say when I said, we're bullish on selling debt for this JPA construct that Jeff was talking about, the primary source of financing would be the municipal bond market, and that happens to be in a good spot right now in terms of investor activity, where rates are, but things change. So, and obviously it's a long project that would, require financing over a longer period of time, but the more you can get done and get going with low interest rates is good. And as a ratepayer, I'm saying that.
Couple of quick comments I would make to add to it. $17 billion. This project is expected to last about 75 years and supply water to 1 in every 2 Californians currently. Actually, for Met, it would be 1 in every 2 Californians, but it supplies water to the South Bay, Silicon Valley, other parts. Roughly about 25 million Californians, 2 out of every 3 Californians. For 75 years, I look at other projects similar. The modernization of LAX, $14 billion, more than phase 1 of this. LA County, over the next decade, MTA is going to put $100 billion into transportation between the major subway systems and freeway overhauls. So in the scheme of things in California, it is a relatively modest project for what it delivers, but you know, we're a big state. $2 trillion GDP, $2 trillion assessed valuation in Southern California alone. So these are, you know, all our numbers are big here.
And the value of that real estate in Southern California is going to be significantly impacted by the reliability of the water supply, it's safe to say. Another question? And yes?
So, Mark, you mentioned that there's now an opportunity to have win-win across the board when speaking about going to this more phased approach. And then you went and spoke about some other issues about better understanding of the science and the deep science, like your example about the salmon, and about the controlling of the water being more relating to the science base. So what is, in your mind, from what you're seeing on this very complex group that you bring together, seeing this opportunity for win-win, is it because it's a phased approach? Is it because of the better understanding of the deep science? Is it because of the control of the water? Or all of these three coming together finally that's making that sea change you talk about?
I would say it's all three coming together and more. And we've got people that are deeply invested in this, you know, that are now more willing to talk, I think, than they were 6, 7 years ago. I think that's part of that's sort of implied in the framework of your question. And I think we still have people that are kind of like zero-sum folks, you know, all or nothing. So my challenge, people like me, is going to have to be talk to some of our neighbors, and you know we're the people that have to do that. They're not going to, frankly, listen to people that aren't their neighbors. They don't have a relationship. You've got to fight it out with your family, so to speak. So I anticipate having some of those discussions. We'll see how it goes. I think we have some willing partners. I've been working on that for a long time, as have other folks. So I think that there's the intangible, right, that I'm trying to describe now. Then there's the tangible, which is what the calendar is. You know, things are happening now with the state and the federal government that are on the calendar. Those are much more tangible. And it's, you know, we just scratched the surface here about what all this, we haven't even talked about water rights, Michael's favorite topic. And that's a huge issue here, solving those things. But the point is, just to try to wrap this up and make it more simple but truthful, the book's open. It's not going to be open for very much longer. But the book's open, and now, you know, with people's support of folks like you in this room in various ways, you know, you can make a difference. It may be little, maybe big, I don't know. But everybody's here because you care. Everybody's here because, you know, you are some of the experts in the field. So you too can have an impact and a difference in this very, very important project. I hope I answered your question as well as I could.
One quick comment on that. I also think one thing that's pushing people to have a more open dialogue than we've had in the past is both sides of the debate realize the status quo is not working. It's working to the detriment of everyone, to water supply, to quality, to the environment, to the residents. What we have today is not sustainable, and we have to do something. We're all large amount of disagreement about what we should do and how much, but everyone knows you're going to have to do something. What we have today simply isn't working.
I think we got time for one more question.
So, I agree this is not sustainable, absolutely. But we have two big projects at the moment here in California. We have high-speed rail, we have this potential project. We have a governor who is a proponent of both of these projects. Can this state really take on both of these kinds of infrastructure projects, given the size and complexity and divisiveness that these kind of projects have entailed in this state?
Absolutely, we can.
I'll just say a couple words. Any of you guys can add. Obviously, we're a huge state. To my mind, it's not the financing or the governance of it, but it is the divisiveness is very large on both of these projects, and that is hard to keep them both moving in that atmosphere, and that's a challenge. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I would add just kind of some of the themes we talked about before is that, yes, they're both big projects, big numbers. Jeff mentioned some other ones here in LA ongoing. If you take the, if you just pragmatically look at, okay, what are we building? Who's paying for it? What does that cost in terms of, you know, a monthly bill or a per capita charge? They are doable, I think. You know, it takes political will.
My answer is yes.
Okay. Join me in thanking the panel. I appreciate the discussion.